Ma'am, according to these papers, this house no longer belongs to you. The sheriff's voice was gentle, almost apologetic, but the words still hit me harder than the Florida heat pressing against my front porch that afternoon. I stood there in my faded pale blue blouse, one hand gripping the screen door while the other held the envelope I'd found taped to my mailbox just an hour earlier. Final notice: vacate the property within 7 days. At 71 years old, after living in this lake house for more than 3 decades, I was being told to leave my own home. I looked past the sheriff toward the gravel driveway where my daughter-in-law Vanessa stood beside her white Mercedes wearing oversized sunglasses and a linen dress that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. Even from 20 feet away, I could see the satisfaction hiding behind her carefully rehearsed concern. I told Daniel this would upset her, she said softly, crossing her arms. But we tried to handle this privately for months. Months. The word echoed bitterly in my chest because nobody had told me anything for months. The only thing I'd noticed lately was how my son stopped visiting as often, how phone calls became shorter, how Vanessa suddenly insisted on handling all the paperwork after my husband Walter passed away the previous winter. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably beside the porch railing. Cicadas buzzed loudly from the palm trees lining the yard, and somewhere across Lake Harmon, I could hear a boat engine humming through the humid afternoon air. Everything around me felt painfully normal, while my entire life quietly collapsed. Mrs. Carter, the sheriff said carefully, I just need to confirm whether you were aware of the ownership transfer. Ownership transfer. I stared at him blankly. What transfer? For the first time since arriving, the sheriff looked genuinely confused. Vanessa stepped forward too quickly. Evelyn, please don't do this, she said in a calm voice that sounded practiced. Daniel explained everything after Walter died. The house was transferred last year because of the tax situation. I turned toward her slowly. My husband built this house with his own hands, I said quietly. Transferred to who? Vanessa removed her sunglasses then, and for just a second, I saw something flicker across her face. Not sympathy. Panic. The sheriff glanced down at the documents again. According to county records, the property was transferred into Carter Coastal Holdings LLC approximately 11 months ago. I felt the blood drain from my face. I had never heard of Carter Coastal Holdings. Walter had never mentioned it. And my husband told me everything. Every mortgage payment. Every repair. Every decision. After 42 years of marriage, there were no secrets between us. Or at least that was what I believed until that moment standing barefoot on my own porch while strangers discussed my home like I no longer belonged there. Vanessa quickly stepped beside the sheriff before I could speak again. Daniel's at a meeting in Tampa, she said. He didn't want this to happen like this. Of course he didn't. My son never liked uncomfortable conversations. Even as a little boy, he used to disappear whenever tension entered a room. I suddenly remembered the way he avoided my eyes during Sunday lunch 2 weeks earlier when I asked why the property tax bills had stopped arriving in the mail. Vanessa answered for him that day too. Everything's automated now, Evelyn. Automated. Such a simple word. Such a dangerous one. The sheriff cleared his throat softly. Ma'am, there's one more thing. He handed me a photocopy of the deed, but instead of looking at the signatures, my eyes stopped on the filing date immediately beneath them. 11 months ago. 2 weeks after Walter's funeral. My fingers trembled slightly against the paper. Then the sheriff lowered his voice. I probably shouldn't say this, he murmured carefully, but the filing itself looks unusual. Vanessa's head snapped toward him instantly. Excuse me. But the sheriff kept his eyes on me. You may want to speak with the county records office before making any decisions. For the first time all afternoon, something shifted inside me. The grief was still there. The confusion too. But underneath it, something colder began settling quietly into place. Because after burying my husband, surviving cancer 10 years earlier, and rebuilding my life more times than anyone knew, I had learned one thing about betrayal. The truth always leaves fingerprints behind. After the sheriff left, the house felt strangely hollow, as if the walls themselves had overheard everything and no longer recognized me. I locked the front door carefully even though my hands would not stop trembling. Through the living room windows, I could still see Vanessa standing beside her car at the edge of the driveway, speaking into her phone. She looked irritated now, pacing back and forth in expensive sandals while the late afternoon sun reflected off the windshield behind her. I knew she was calling Daniel, probably trying to control the story before I had the chance to ask questions. I stood quietly in the center of the living room Walter built 33 years ago. The ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. The old grandfather clock near the fireplace ticked steadily in the silence. Everything inside that room carried his fingerprints. The cedar shelves he installed himself. The pale cream curtains we picked together at a small fabric store in Orlando back in 1996. Even the faint scratches on the hardwood floor near the hallway came from the rocking chair where Daniel used to sit as a little boy eating peanut butter crackers while watching cartoons on Saturday mornings. I walked toward the kitchen and filled a glass with water from the sink, but the water tasted warm. The air conditioning had been struggling again for weeks. In Florida heat, that kind of problem could not wait long, but every repair estimate I received felt impossible on my budget. I had started using only one room during the afternoons just to save on electricity. Some evenings, I sat on the screened porch with a damp towel around my shoulders because the humidity inside the house became unbearable after sunset. Daniel never knew any of that. Or maybe he did and chose not to ask. After Walter died, people assumed I was handling grief quietly because I had always been composed. What nobody saw were the small humiliations that slowly became my daily life. Standing in the pharmacy aisle, calculating whether I could afford both my blood pressure medication and fresh groceries in the same week. Ignoring strange sounds coming from my old Buick because I could not pay for repairs. Pretending the leaking kitchen faucet did not bother me because hiring a plumber meant sacrificing something else later. Meanwhile, Vanessa posted photographs online from rooftop restaurants in Miami and weekend boat trips along the Gulf Coast. Smiling beside Daniel in matching white outfits while captions talked about blessings, gratitude, and family success. Family. The word had started feeling unfamiliar lately. I carried my water glass onto the back porch and lowered myself carefully into Walter's old chair overlooking the lake. The wood creaked beneath me. Across the water, evening light shimmered softly against the surface while pelicans drifted low near the docks. Walter loved this view more than anything. During the last summer before his heart gave out, he spent nearly every evening sitting exactly where I was now, drinking iced tea and talking about fixing the old fishing pier before hurricane season arrived. "This house will outlive both of us," he used to say with a quiet smile. "And it will always protect you." I believed him. That was the painful part. I believed every promise my husband ever made because Walter Carter was not careless with words. He spent 42 years proving that love could look ordinary and still be strong. He remembered every anniversary, fixed every broken cabinet, held my hand during chemotherapy appointments 10 years ago without once complaining about the hospital smell or the long hours. Even near the end, when his breathing became weaker, he still worried more about whether I had eaten lunch than about himself. Which was why none of this made sense. Walter would never have secretly transferred this house away from me. Never. I set the glass down slowly on the porch table and stared toward the lake again. Then another memory surfaced quietly in my mind. About 8 months before Walter died, Vanessa suddenly became very interested in our finances. She offered to help organize paperwork after Daniel complained that we were still managing everything through mailed bank statements instead of online accounts. At the time, it sounded practical, helpful even. Vanessa always spoke confidently, like someone used to taking control of situations before others could question her motives. I remembered the afternoon she sat at this very kitchen table sorting through folders while smiling politely. "You and Walter should simplify things, Evelyn," she told me. "At your age, paperwork can become overwhelming." At your age? I should have noticed the way she said it. Soft enough to sound caring. Sharp enough to leave a bruise afterward. My eyes drifted toward the envelope still lying unopened beside the kitchen counter. Final notice. 7 days. The words no longer frightened me the same way they had earlier, because beneath the fear now sat something else. Something steady. The sheriff's voice repeated itself in my mind. The filing itself looks unusual. I did not fully understand what that meant yet. But for the first time since Walter's funeral, I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel in months. Suspicion. The next morning, I woke before sunrise the way I always did after bad news. Sleep had never stayed long in this house since Walter died. I stood quietly in the kitchen brewing coffee while soft gray light slowly crept across the lake outside the windows. The air conditioner rattled weakly above me, struggling against another humid Florida morning. By 7 o'clock, sweat already clung lightly to the back of my neck. I carried my coffee onto the porch and opened the county records website on my old laptop. The screen flickered twice before finally loading. Walter used to joke that the computer belonged in a museum, but I kept it because he bought it for me the Christmas before he retired. There were still tiny scratches near the keyboard from where our granddaughter Lily once spilled orange juice while trying to play games online. I typed the property address slowly. My hands felt steadier than they had yesterday. Not calm exactly. Focused. The page loaded several property records stretching back more than 30 years. Tax payments, permit approvals, insurance filings after Hurricane Irma, damaged the roof in 2017. Everything looked familiar until I reached the newest transfer record filed 11 months ago. My stomach tightened immediately. The document listed Walter's signature and mine. Except the signature beside my name was not mine at all. It looked close enough from a distance. Similar curves, similar slant. But the longer I stared at it, the stranger it became. Whoever signed that document copied my handwriting carefully without understanding how I actually wrote. They made the letters too neat, too slow. Walter used to tease me for rushing through signatures because I always hated paperwork. This signature looked patient, deliberate, like someone practicing. I enlarged the image until the letters blurred at the edges. Then I noticed something else. The witness line carried a name I recognized immediately. Vanessa Whitmore Carter. My chest went cold. Vanessa had witnessed the transfer herself. I leaned back slowly in Walter's chair while the ceiling fan hummed overhead. Outside, a heron stepped carefully along the edge of the dock, searching the shallow water for fish. The ordinary calmness of the morning felt surreal against the panic building quietly inside me. I clicked deeper into the filing history. Several mailing addresses had been updated over the past year. One of them belonged to a luxury condominium complex in Naples. I recognized the address because Vanessa posted photographs from the rooftop pool constantly last summer. Another line showed electronic tax notices redirected away from my home 8 months earlier. Redirected. I suddenly remembered standing at this very counter in February telling Daniel I had not received the property tax statement yet. "Do not worry about it, Mom," he said too quickly while glancing toward Vanessa. "Everything is probably digital now." At the time, I believed him because grief makes people trust the nearest voice, especially when that voice belongs to your child. I closed the laptop slowly and rubbed my temples. A memory surfaced from several months earlier. Walter had still been alive then, thinner than usual, but determined to remain independent. One afternoon, I walked into the den and found Vanessa sitting beside him with folders spread across the coffee table. She smiled warmly when she noticed me. "Just helping Walter organize things," she explained. Walter looked tired that day. Confused too. Not seriously confused. Just exhausted from medications and constant appointments. I remembered asking if he needed me there, but Vanessa answered before he could speak. "We have everything under control, Evelyn." Under control. The phrase sounded different now. My phone buzzed suddenly against the porch table. "Daniel." I stared at his name for several seconds before answering. "Mom," he said immediately, sounding tense. "Vanessa told me about yesterday. I wish you would have called me before things got emotional." Emotional? I looked across the lake while heat shimmered above the water. "Did you know about the deed?" I asked quietly. Silence filled the line for 2 long seconds. "Walter wanted things protected," Daniel finally said. "Protected from what?" Another silence. Then papers shuffled somewhere near him. Office sounds. A printer. Distant voices. He was at work pretending his mother, losing her home, was another business problem squeezed between meetings. "Mom, Vanessa and I have been trying to simplify things financially. The house is expensive to maintain. We thought eventually you might move somewhere easier." Easier. Like elderly people were furniture that needed downsizing. "You thought wrong," I said softly. Daniel exhaled heavily. "Please do not make this harder than it already is." I closed my eyes then because suddenly I could hear Walter's voice from years earlier warning me about something I never wanted to believe. "Our son has a good heart," Walter once told me after Daniel married Vanessa. "But good hearts can still be led by weaker minds." At the time, I thought he was being unfair. Sitting alone on the porch now, I realized my husband may have understood far more than he ever admitted. That afternoon, I drove to the Polk County Records office in my old Buick with the windows rolled down because the air conditioner barely worked anymore. The Florida heat wrapped around me like a damp blanket while traffic crawled slowly through. Downtown Winter Haven. I kept both hands tight on the steering wheel the entire drive, replaying every conversation from the past year inside my head. Every missing envelope. Every moment Vanessa answered questions before Daniel could speak. Every time somebody told me not to worry. By the time I parked beside the courthouse building, my stomach felt tight with something heavier than fear. Grief had clouded too many things after Walter died. I understood that now. The records office sat on the second floor beneath harsh fluorescent lights that made everyone look exhausted. A young woman with dark blonde hair sat behind the front counter organizing folders into neat stacks. She looked up and smiled politely when I approached. "Can I help you, ma'am?" she asked. I placed the printed deed carefully onto the counter between us. "I think something may be wrong with this filing," I said quietly. Her name tag read Melissa Grant. She could not have been older than 30. At first, she gave the document only a routine glance, but within seconds her expression changed slightly. Not dramatic, just focused. She adjusted her glasses and leaned closer to the screen beside her computer. "Do you mind waiting a moment?" she asked. I nodded and sat down near the window overlooking the parking lot below. Outside, palm trees bent gently in the afternoon wind, while courthouse employees hurried toward their cars carrying iced coffees and takeout bags. Ordinary lives moving normally, while mine felt suspended somewhere between confusion and humiliation. 10 minutes passed before Melissa returned holding another folder. "Mrs. Carter," she said carefully, lowering her voice. "This filing has a few irregularities." The word irregularities sounded strangely comforting because finally somebody else saw it too. Melissa placed two documents side by side on the counter. "This is your original property deed from 1991, she explained. "And this is the transfer filed last year." I immediately noticed the difference. Walter's signature on the original deed carried the same strong slant I knew by heart after 4 decades of marriage. Confident, fast, familiar, but the newer filing looked stiff somehow, forced. "The notary information does not match our active records," Melissa continued softly. "And there is another issue." She pointed toward the electronic submission log attached to the transfer. "This filing was submitted online through a private business account linked to Carter Coastal Holdings." I swallowed carefully. "My daughter-in-law mentioned that company yesterday." Melissa hesitated before speaking again. "Do you personally know who manages the company?" "No," I admitted. I had never heard the name until yesterday. Melissa looked uncomfortable now. "The registered contact for the company is Vanessa Carter." The room suddenly felt smaller around me. For several seconds, all I could hear was the low humming sound from the fluorescent lights overhead. Vanessa had not simply witnessed the transfer. She controlled the company that supposedly owned my home. "There is something else," Melissa added gently. She opened another page showing mailing address updates tied to the property account. "Tax correspondence and legal notices stopped being sent to your address about 8 months ago." "Who changed it?" I asked quietly, even though I already knew the answer. Melissa turned the monitor slightly toward me. "Naples Luxury Bay Residences. Vanessa's condominium address." I stared at the screen while memories rose one after another with painful clarity. Vanessa insisting she would handle online billing because paper statements get lost. Vanessa offering to collect my mail whenever I visited church friends for the weekend. Vanessa taking Walter's laptop home several times after his diagnosis because she claimed she wanted to organize financial passwords. I remembered one afternoon especially clearly now. Walter had been asleep in the bedroom after chemotherapy treatments exhausted him. Vanessa stood in the kitchen scrolling through paperwork while Daniel loaded groceries into the pantry. "You should consider simplifying ownership structures," she told us casually. "It protects families from probate headaches later." Walter barely looked up from his chair. "Everything already belongs to Evelyn," he said firmly. Vanessa smiled after that. A small smile, tight around the edges. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Sitting in the records office now, I finally understood why she looked disappointed. Melissa interrupted my thoughts carefully. "Mrs. Carter, I cannot give legal advice, but if I were you, I would contact an attorney immediately." I nodded slowly. Then I looked back down at the forged deed resting between us beneath the courthouse lights. My name sat there in shaky imitation beneath Walter's. Somebody had tried to erase me from my own life using paperwork and patience. But they made one mistake. They assumed grief had made me blind forever. I left the courthouse carrying photocopies of the deed inside a plain manila folder that suddenly felt heavier than anything I had carried since Walter's funeral. Outside, storm clouds had begun gathering over the lake, turning the Florida sky a dull shade of gray. The air smelled like rain and hot pavement. I sat inside my Buick for several minutes without starting the engine, staring through the windshield while people crossed the parking lot with umbrellas tucked under their arms. My hands rested quietly on the folder in my lap. For the first time in months, my grief had shifted into something sharper. Not anger exactly. Clarity. On the drive home, I stopped at a small diner near Cypress Gardens Boulevard where Walter and I used to eat breakfast on Saturdays before church. The place had not changed in 20 years. Same faded blue booths. Same smell of coffee and buttered toast hanging in the air. I ordered soup even though I was not hungry because suddenly I realized I had barely eaten in 2 days. Across the room, an older couple sat sharing a slice of pie while holding hands over the table. I had to look away. Loss never truly leaves. It only changes shape. While stirring crackers into my soup, I pulled out my phone and searched for the name Melissa had quietly written on the back of her business card before I left the records office. Harold Bennett, real estate attorney, Winter Haven, family property disputes. I almost put the phone away again. Part of me still wanted to believe there had been some misunderstanding buried underneath all this. Paperwork. Some terrible mistake Daniel allowed Vanessa to handle without fully understanding the consequences. But then I remembered the mailing address redirects. The forged signature. The company listing Vanessa as registered contact. Those were not misunderstandings. Those were decisions. By late afternoon, rain hammered against the windows of the attorney's office while I sat across from Harold Bennett in a quiet room lined with old legal books. He looked to be in his late 60s with silver hair and reading glasses balanced low on his nose. The kind of man who listened fully before speaking. After reviewing the documents silently for several minutes, he leaned back slowly in his chair. "Mrs. Carter," he said carefully, "did you personally sign any transfer paperwork after your husband passed away?" "No." "Did your husband ever mention transferring ownership into a corporation?" "Never." Harold nodded once and removed his glasses. "Then we likely have serious problems here." The words should have frightened me, but oddly they did not. Maybe because deep down I already knew. Harold tapped the forged deed lightly with his finger. "This filing was executed unusually fast following your husband's death. There are inconsistencies in the notary registration, and the electronic transfer trail raises additional concerns." Rainwater slid down the office windows behind him in long silver streaks. "Can they force me out?" I asked quietly. Harold folded his hands together. "Not immediately. Especially not now. Because the deed is false." He studied me carefully before answering. "Because whoever filed this appears to have assumed you would never question it." The room went silent after that. Somewhere down the hallway, a copier hummed steadily while thunder rolled faintly outside. I stared at Walter's wedding ring still resting on my left hand even after all these months. I had not removed it once since the funeral. Harold's voice softened slightly. "You trusted your family." I smiled faintly then, though there was no humor in it. "I trusted my son." Harold nodded like a man who had spent decades watching trust unravel inside courtrooms. Unfortunately, trust is often what makes these situations possible. He spent the next hour explaining legal terms I barely understood. Fraudulent transfer, undue influence, property concealment, electronic filing review. Every phrase sounded cold and clinical compared to the life attached to that house. Walter teaching Daniel how to fish off the dock when he was 8 years old. Christmas dinners crowded around the dining table. Hurricane nights spent together with flashlights and candles after losing power. A marriage measured not by grand moments, but by thousands of ordinary ones stacked quietly together over 42 years. "There is another thing you should know," Harold said finally. He slid one final document toward me. According to county records, Carter Coastal Holdings recently initiated preliminary inquiries about listing the property for sale. I looked up sharply. "Sale?" Harold nodded grimly. The process had not completed yet, but there were early contacts with a brokerage firm in Tampa. For a moment, I could not breathe properly. They were not just trying to remove me from the house. They were preparing to erase it entirely. Every room Walter built, every memory, every trace that we had ever existed there together. Harold watched me quietly while rain continued falling against the windows. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, "I strongly advise that you do not confront them yet." I stared down at the paperwork scattered across his desk. "Why not?" "Because people become careless when they believe they have already won." I sat very still after that. Then slowly, for the first time since the sheriff arrived at my porch, I felt something unexpected settle inside me. Not fear, not grief, patience. The following week passed strangely quietly. Too quietly. That alone told me Harold Bennett had been right. People who believe they have already won stop hiding their confidence. Vanessa called me twice during those days. Both conversations filled with the same polished sweetness that now sounded almost rehearsed. "We are just trying to help you, Evelyn," she said during the second call while I stood watering Walter's orange trees near the dock. "This house is becoming too much responsibility for someone your age." I stared at the lake while warm evening wind moved softly through the branches overhead. "I have managed this property for 33 years, I replied calmly. "I think I can survive another week." Silence lingered briefly on the line before Vanessa laughed lightly, though the sound carried no warmth. "You always were stubborn." "Stubborn? Funny how quickly strength becomes stubbornness once it stops being useful to other people." After we hung up, I remained outside beside the trees for a long time, remembering the first summer Vanessa visited this house nearly 15 years earlier. She arrived wearing white capri pants and oversized sunglasses, carrying an expensive fruit basket she barely touched afterward. Back then, Daniel looked at her with complete devotion. The kind young men mistake for certainty. Walter noticed things before I did. He always had. During dinner that first weekend, Vanessa spent nearly an hour asking detailed questions about lakefront property values around Winter Haven. At the time, I thought she was simply interested in real estate because Daniel worked in commercial development. Later that night, while washing dishes together, Walter quietly said, "That woman counts rooms before she notices people." I scolded him for being unfair. Now those words replayed in my mind constantly. Looking back, the changes inside our family happened slowly enough to feel accidental. Vanessa had never demanded control openly. She earned it piece by piece through helpfulness. First, she convinced Daniel to handle our online banking for convenience. Then she offered to manage Walter's medical paperwork during chemotherapy because hospital forms exhausted him. Later came the passwords, the account updates, the digital billing systems none of us fully understood except her. Every step sounded practical, modern, responsible, and every step moved one more piece of our lives quietly into her hands. I noticed something else too during those years. Daniel stopped speaking with confidence around us whenever Vanessa entered the room. Small things at first. He would change opinions mid-sentence after glancing toward her. Cancel family dinners because Vanessa already made plans. Miss birthdays and church picnics he once loved attending. One Christmas, Walter spent nearly 6 hours smoking a turkey in the backyard only for Daniel to arrive 40 minutes before dessert because Vanessa wanted to attend another party first. Walter never complained afterward, but I remember finding him alone on the porch that night staring out toward the lake long after everyone left. "You can lose children without burying them," he said quietly. At the time, I thought grief from his illness made him overly emotional. But Walter saw the distance growing long before I did. By Thursday afternoon, Harold called with another update. I sat at the kitchen table while thunder rumbled faintly outside and rain streaked softly against the windows. "We found additional filing activity connected to the property," he explained. "It appears preliminary listing photographs were already taken last month." My chest tightened. Photographs. Interior measurements, too. Someone entered the property professionally. I looked slowly around the kitchen. White cabinets. The ceramic rooster cookie jar Walter bought during a road trip through Georgia. The tiny pencil marks near the pantry doorway where we measured Daniel's height every birthday growing up. Strangers had walked through these rooms preparing to sell them while I still lived here. Did Daniel approve this? I asked quietly. Harold hesitated. His signature appears on several authorization forms. I closed my eyes briefly after hearing that. Somehow, that hurt more than Vanessa's deception, because part of me still hoped my son had simply been manipulated. Confused. Weak. But signatures required choices. "There is another thing," Harold continued carefully. The brokerage expected the property to be vacant within 30 days. 30 days. They had already planned my removal down to the calendar. After the call ended, I sat motionless for several minutes listening to rainwater drip steadily from the porch gutters outside. Then my eyes drifted toward a framed photograph near the refrigerator. Walter holding a 10-year-old Daniel beside their fishing boat, both smiling proudly beneath the bright Florida sun. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to ask a question I had spent years avoiding. At what point does love for family become permission for betrayal? The answer arrived quietly inside me while thunder rolled across the lake outside. The moment you stop believing they are capable of it. That evening, Vanessa posted new photographs online from a rooftop restaurant in Tampa. Crystal glasses. Candlelight. Daniel beside her smiling tiredly in a navy blazer. The caption read, "Excited for new beginnings." I studied the photograph carefully before setting my phone face down on the table. Then I stood up, walked to Walter's old desk in the den, and unlocked the bottom drawer where he kept important documents for decades. Inside, beneath faded insurance folders and tax receipts, I found exactly what I had been hoping for. Walter's original handwritten estate notes. And suddenly, for the first time since this nightmare began, I smiled. Walter's estate notes were written in the same dark blue ink he had used for years, neat block letters covering several yellow legal pages folded carefully inside an old envelope. I sat alone at the dining room table beneath the soft glow of the overhead light, while rain continued tapping steadily against the windows outside. The house smelled faintly of coffee and old cedar wood. For the first time in weeks, I felt close to my husband again. Not through memories, through certainty. Walter had dated every page by hand during the final months of his illness. Some notes listed passwords and account numbers. Others contained instructions about insurance policies and maintenance schedules for the house. But one paragraph near the bottom of the third page made my hands stop completely. Under no circumstances should ownership of the lake property be transferred outside Evelyn's direct control, Walter had written. Temporary assistance from Daniel is acceptable only for bill payments. Vanessa is not to have authority over any property filings or estate decisions. I read the sentence 3 times slowly. Walter knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. Suddenly dozens of small moments rearranged themselves inside my mind like puzzle pieces finally locking together. Walter refusing to discuss finances whenever Vanessa stayed too long after dinner. The arguments I overheard late at night behind his office door during his final months. The day he quietly changed the locks on the filing cabinet in the den without explanation. At the time, I thought illness had simply made him protective. Now I understood he had been trying to hold the line against something he did not fully trust. My phone rang just after 9 o'clock. Daniel. I let it ring twice before answering. Mom, he said quickly. Vanessa told me you hired a lawyer. His voice carried frustration now instead of concern. Somewhere behind him, I could hear dishes clattering softly. Restaurant noise. I spoke with someone. Yes, I answered calmly. This does not need to become ugly, he said immediately. Then why did someone forge my signature? Silence. A long one this time. I stood slowly and walked toward the porch windows overlooking the dark lake outside. Lightning flickered faintly across distant clouds. Nobody forged anything, Daniel finally muttered. You signed papers after Dad died. You were emotional and probably forgot. I closed my eyes briefly because the lie sounded weak even to him. Walter left written instructions, I said quietly. He specifically stated Vanessa was never to control the property. The silence that followed felt completely different now. Sharp. Alarmed. Then Daniel lowered his voice. Mom, you should not go through Dad's private documents. Private documents. Not forged signatures. Not stolen property. That was the part bothering him. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Do you even hear yourself anymore? I asked softly. Daniel exhaled heavily into the phone. You always think Vanessa is the problem. Is she not? Another silence. Then his tone hardened slightly. You never accepted her. I stared out toward the dock while warm rain drifted sideways across the lake. I invited her into this family, I replied quietly. There is a difference. He did not answer that because deep down he knew it was true. For years I defended Vanessa during every uncomfortable holiday dinner and every canceled family gathering. I told Walter he was imagining things whenever he questioned her motives. I convinced myself modern families simply work differently now. Boundaries, privacy, space. That was the language everyone used. Meanwhile, Vanessa quietly removed us piece by piece from our own lives until even my grief became useful to her. Daniel spoke again after several seconds, his voice lower now. Vanessa says you are planning to challenge the transfer. I am planning to protect my home. The house is too much for you. There it was again. Not concern. Strategy disguised as concern. I looked around the dining room slowly. Walter's favorite chair near the fireplace. The china cabinet inherited from my mother. Family photographs lining the shelves beside the kitchen doorway. Too much for me. As though aging suddenly erased ownership. Do you know what hurts most? I asked quietly. Daniel stayed silent. It is not the paperwork. It is realizing how long you both waited for me to become weak enough not to fight back. His breathing caught slightly over the line. For one brief second, I heard the little boy he used to be hiding underneath the man he became. Mom, he started softly. But before he could continue, another voice interrupted in the background. Vanessa, calm, controlled. Ask her if she plans on leaving voluntarily. The sentence was not meant for me, but I heard every word clearly. Something inside me settled completely after that. Not shattered. Settled. Like muddy water finally becoming still enough to see through. Daniel returned to the phone, sounding exhausted. We are trying to avoid court. I looked down at Walter's handwritten notes still spread across the dining table beneath the light. No, I said quietly. You are trying to avoid the truth. Then I ended the call. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the lake, while rain continued falling over the house they already believed belonged to them. But for the first time since this began, I no longer felt alone inside it. 3 days later, Vanessa invited me to dinner. The message arrived just after noon while I was trimming dead branches near the dock behind the house. Family dinner tonight. We should all talk calmly. Calmly. The word almost made me smile. I stood beneath the heavy Florida sun reading the message twice, while sweat rolled slowly down my back beneath my blouse. Then I looked out across the lake, where Walter once spent entire afternoons teaching Daniel how to steer their old fishing boat through shallow water. This house carried too many memories to surrender quietly. Go, Harold told me later that afternoon during our phone call. And do not argue. Let them speak. By 6 o'clock, storm clouds hung low over Winter Haven again when I pulled into the parking lot outside an upscale waterfront restaurant in Tampa, where Daniel and Vanessa liked entertaining clients. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the marina, and soft jazz drifted through the dining room, while waiters carried trays of seafood and wine between polished tables. Vanessa stood the moment she saw me approaching. She wore a cream-colored dress with gold earrings and the same careful smile she used whenever appearances mattered more than honesty. Evelyn, she said warmly, leaning forward to kiss the air beside my cheek. You look tired. I hope you are taking care of yourself. Daniel remained seated beside the window, his expression tense and distracted. He looked older than he had only a week earlier. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes, and his tie sat slightly crooked against his collar. Guilt does that to people eventually. I sat down quietly across from them and folded my hands in my lap. Outside, boats rocked gently against the docks beneath gathering clouds. For several minutes, Vanessa spoke casually about traffic, weather, and restaurant renovations nearby, as though we were an ordinary family sharing dinner instead of sitting on top of betrayal. Then finally, she placed her wine glass down carefully and sighed. Evelyn, she began softly. This situation has become emotionally unhealthy for everyone. There it was. Not fraud. Not forged signatures. Emotional health. The language people use when they want to turn cruelty into concern. I said nothing. Vanessa continued smoothly. Daniel and I have discussed everything carefully with financial advisors. The house is simply not practical anymore. The taxes alone are becoming overwhelming. Daniel stared down at the table while she spoke. And relocating you somewhere smaller would allow all of us peace of mind, she added. Smaller. As if reducing a life made it easier to manage. A waiter arrived with menus, but none of us opened them. Rain began tapping softly against the tall windows beside our table. Did either of you ever plan to tell me the house was being listed for sale? I asked quietly. Daniel's head lifted immediately. Vanessa answered before he could speak. That was only exploratory. Nothing had been finalized. Photographs were taken. Vanessa's smile tightened almost invisibly. Standard preparation. Using forged ownership records? For the first time all evening, silence settled heavily across the table. Daniel rubbed his forehead slowly while Vanessa leaned back in her chair, studying me carefully now, like someone reassessing a problem that no longer behaved predictably. You hired an aggressive attorney, she finally said. I hired someone who reads paperwork. Her expression hardened slightly, then softened again just as quickly. Vanessa had always been skilled at controlling her face. Evelyn, she said patiently, I think grief is affecting how you interpret things. I almost admired the confidence required to say that while sitting across from the woman whose signature she forged. Almost. Walter left handwritten instructions, I replied calmly. He specifically excluded you from property authority. Daniel's face drained of color instantly. Vanessa turned toward him sharply before recovering herself. Handwritten notes are not legally binding, she said carefully, but fraudulent transfers are legally problematic. Another silence. Rainfall grew heavier outside while distant lightning flickered across the dark marina water. Daniel finally spoke then, his voice strained and low. Mom, maybe we all made mistakes. Mistakes. Such a small word for something this deliberate. I looked at my son for a long moment. The little boy who once cried because he accidentally stepped on a turtle crossing our driveway after summer rainstorms. The teenager who used to leave handwritten Mother's Day notes beside my coffee cup every May. Somewhere along the way, weakness slowly replaced character. And he married someone who knew exactly how to use it. Vanessa folded her hands neatly on the table. What exactly do you want from us? She asked. The question surprised me because suddenly I realized she still believed this was negotiable. That maybe I only wanted apologies. Money. Recognition. Something simple enough to settle privately before lawyers and courts became involved. I reached slowly into my purse and placed a photocopy of Walter's handwritten estate notes onto the table between us. Vanessa's eyes dropped toward the page. Then I watched something shift behind them for the very first time since this nightmare began. Fear. Real fear. Because beneath Walter's instructions sat a final sentence written in dark blue ink. If any transfer occurs outside Evelyn's knowledge, investigate immediately. Daniel stared at the page like someone watching his own life collapse in slow motion. Outside the restaurant windows, thunder rolled across the marina while rain blurred the city lights into long silver streaks. And for the first time since Walter died, the people sitting across from me no longer looked confident. The lawsuit moved faster than I expected. Harold explained that once the county investigators reviewed the filing records, several things became impossible to ignore. The forged signature, the false notary credentials, the electronic submission linked directly to Carter Coastal Holdings. By the second week, the attempted property sale had been frozen completely. By the third, subpoenas had been issued requesting financial records tied to the transfer. Through all of it, I remained inside the lake house exactly where Walter intended me to be. Some mornings I still woke before sunrise expecting to hear his footsteps moving through the kitchen. Grief does not disappear just because truth finally arrives. It simply learns to sit beside it. Daniel stopped calling for several days after the restaurant dinner. Vanessa, however, sent multiple carefully worded messages through attorneys, insisting everything resulted from clerical misunderstandings and emotional confusion following bereavement. Harold read one of the letters aloud during our meeting and actually sighed halfway through. People always underestimate how clearly older women remember disrespect, he muttered quietly. Outside his office window, late summer sunlight reflected sharply off parked cars while palm trees swayed gently in the Florida heat. Will they face criminal charges? I asked softly. Harold removed his glasses and studied me carefully before answering. Possibly, but most likely, they are hoping to settle quietly before it reaches that point. Quietly. That word again. Everybody wanted silence after spending months counting on mine. A few days later, Daniel appeared at the house alone just before sunset. I saw his car pulling slowly into the driveway while I sat on the porch shelling peas into a ceramic bowl Walter bought me years ago from a roadside market outside Savannah. Daniel stepped out wearing jeans and a wrinkled blue shirt, looking exhausted in a way expensive restaurants and luxury condos could not hide anymore. He climbed the porch steps slowly, stopping near the screen door like a stranger uncertain whether he still belonged there. Mom, he said quietly. I nodded toward the empty chair across from me. He sat down heavily while evening light stretched golden across the lake behind him. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Cicadas buzzed loudly in the trees while boats drifted slowly toward the marina before dark. Finally, Daniel rubbed both hands over his face and exhaled shakily. I did not know everything, he admitted. Not at first. I kept shelling peas calmly into the bowl resting in my lap. But eventually you did. His silence answered for him. Vanessa said we were protecting assets, he continued weakly. She said probate could become messy and expensive after Dad passed. So you signed papers anyway. She handled most of it. I looked at him then. Really looked at him. Not the successful businessman from magazine photographs or the polished developer entertaining clients in Tampa restaurants. Just my son. Older now. Tired. Frightened. Weak in ways Walter always worried he would become. Do you know what hurts most? I asked softly. Daniel stared toward the lake without answering. Not the house. Not the signatures. It is realizing your father spent his final months trying to protect me from people inside his own family. Daniel's eyes closed briefly after hearing that. For the first time since this nightmare began, tears finally appeared there. Quiet ones. Ashamed ones. I never wanted you homeless, he whispered. I set the bowl down carefully beside my chair. Then why was the property already listed for sale? His face crumpled slightly because there was no answer left to give. The truth had stripped away every excuse until only choices remained underneath. We sat quietly together while the sun lowered across Lake Harmon, turning the water deep shades of orange and gold. Eventually Daniel spoke again, barely above a whisper. Vanessa moved out yesterday. I nodded once. Somehow that news felt less satisfying than I once imagined it might. Betrayal leaves damage behind even after consequences arrive. The investigators think she redirected other funds too, he continued numbly. Business accounts. Insurance payments. I did not know. Walter was right, I thought silently. Good hearts can still be led by weaker minds. Daniel looked around the porch slowly. The old swing. Walter's fishing poles near the corner. The wind chimes I bought during our 25th anniversary trip to Charleston. Dad loved this place, he said quietly. He built it for us. I corrected gently. Not for ownership. For family. The word family hung painfully between us after that. Before leaving, Daniel stopped near the porch steps and turned back toward me. I do not expect forgiveness, he said softly. I know, I replied. And strangely, that was enough for now. After he drove away, I remained on the porch alone while darkness settled slowly across the lake. The air smelled like orange blossoms and approaching rain. Somewhere nearby, frogs croaked softly along the shoreline, while warm wind moved through the trees Walter planted decades earlier with his own hands. I leaned back in my chair and looked out across the water shimmering beneath the first stars of evening. They thought age made me fragile. They thought grief made me blind. But what they forgot was something Walter understood until his final breath. A woman who survives loss learns exactly how much of herself is worth protecting.